A meeting is held in Panovich Palace with the leader Premier Ivan and all of his top advisors. The meeting will be held in complete secrecy from the public and from all other world leaders. They would be discussing the future of geopolitics as we know it. Little did the world know, this meeting would change everything. But just, how did we get here? Pagan Map was a relatively stable world, ruled by the vast Premy Empire, which was responsible for over 70% of the global economy. It owned the entirety of the north of the Pangean continent and was made up of dozens of ethnicities. Premier Ivan ruled with an iron fist, suppressing any speech made against him. He was also controlling all of the politics of the global south. Premy even had a satellite state in Charmany to keep Truperia and Ericsville in check. Any nation trying to break away from Premy control would coincidentally have a coup or a huge revolt. You know, it's a total coincidence. The center of the map? Huge fucking mess. With the Finns, Merivanians, and Goleshtanis and Garians fighting over land. This was kind of like the Balkans of Pagan Map. Many of these wars would be backed by the Premy Empire to keep the nations weak and unable to resist any Premy string pulling. Then there was the two southern giants. Japsky, a giant nation, heavily unstable, with, you know, tons of different ethnicities and constant civil wars. And then there was Ruskova, the second richest nation and a country with the largest anti-Premy sentiment. It was seen as a direct counter to Premy, however, it was far weaker. And it was kept in check by the Advantage Enclave, owned by the Premy Empire itself. The Premy, he had everybody on the leash. There's also the Pagan Nation, however, it's literally just a shithole where bold pagans go to smoke and get high. It's not that interesting. Anyway, and that was the world of Pagan Map for multiple decades. Multiple long decades, until one fateful day in central Pangaea. A war would break out between Merivania and Finland, eventually bringing the entire region into all-out war. Now, many records of this war have been burned, destroyed, and we don't actually know how the war began. However, many researchers, you know, they kind of believe that the Finnish president called the Merivanian president, I'm not joking, a clinical retard. And this just completely broke down negotiations. This is a true story, by the way, allegedly. Now, the war was fought. The war was absolutely ferocious. However, it ended with a resounding Merivanian victory and the full annexations of Merian and Finland. Gary Nation would survive the war. However, it would be in great turmoil, let's just say. As Merivania began prospering with a Premy-friendly regime, it would come out in local opposition newspapers how the Premy Empire helped fund the Merivanian army to destabilize the region. Now, this was huge because this was the first truly anti-Premy act to occur in decades. With inflation rising, many young students across the Gary Nation noticed how Premy controlled 70% of the global economy. He had their hands in all their politics and controlled every aspect of their lives. Soon enough, the pro-Premy regime would be attacked. Government buildings burned, protests, riots occurring in cities. It seemed like the tide was turning and the students would actually start an anti-Premy revolution. However, it would not last long! The fierce Premy army crossed the border and clamped down on Gary Nation with full force. A total massacre of the Garian people. Now, the Gary Nation will be incorporated even closer into the regime, making it an official puppet state of Premy, just like Charmany. The fight for the Garian people would not be forgotten. Pandora's box had just been opened, and many other nations began, let's just say, noticing. Now, the first major consequence of the Garian Revolution was the Charmany Spring. This would occur in Charmany, where the entire nation fell into a deep anarchy, so much so that even the Premy Special Forces weren't able to control it, and it seemed like Charmany would overthrow the Premy regime, right? Well, Truperia and Ericsville had different opinions on this. They would launch a huge war into Charmany to annex the entire nation into their own spheres of influence. Following the fall of Charmany, the Premier himself would ask to have a meeting with Commander Brito Roskiski of Ruskova and Japish Tukral of Japski. This meeting would hopefully end tensions and allow the Premy Empire to continue its dominion over others. But would it go that way? We'll find out in a second, because I'm getting some news right now. Something is going down in Angolistan. A huge civil war occurs in Angolistan, where the Memestani minority declares independence as the independent state of Memistan. The civil war wouldn't last long, as the Angolistanis wanted to keep their power for a potential new global war. So Memistan would gain independence as a relatively weak nation, and Angolistan would eagerly be waiting to regain its lost lands. Now, side note, the Premy Empire would create a new puppet nation called Emania that was ruled by the Premier's personal love interest, Emma Johnson. Now, this story does not have a happy ending because it would turn out that Emma Johnson was actually a Punjabi scammer from Japski dressing as a woman. This story actually is blowing my mind. What is going on? Anyway, where were we? Oh yeah. The most important meeting of all time. The meeting would go on for hours, however negotiations would begin breaking down. Tukral and Roskiski would go against everything the Premier offered. It reached a boiling point once Premier Van offered for the three leaders to go up on stage with pictures of Joe Biden driving a car to show unity. The Premier was going insane. The Ruskovan and Japski leaders saw Premier as a complete joke, and it would leave the Premy capital. This would cause the Empire to go into pure chaos, as Premier would call an emergency with all of his advisors and generals. And this brings us back to where we began this video. Premier and his generals would all agree on an emergency broadcast the following day. The broadcast would see Premier leaking Commander Brito Roskiski's hair to the entire world. Now, your hair was quite a sacred thing in Ruskovan culture at the time, so this was seen as the biggest act of disrespect possible, and this sparked huge gatherings across Ruskova, and the nation would officially prepare for war and start gathering other world leaders. Within a few days, an entire global coalition, simply known as the Anti-Premy Coalition, would form, and total war was declared on the state of Premy. Early in the morning, Trouparian and Japski and Ruskovan planes would fly over Panovsky and bomb it heavily, somehow bypassing the Premier's air defense. Huge amounts of men would begin arming on the borders of Gary Nation, Eriksville, and Emania. Eriksville, Trouparia, and Emania would launch a huge invasion of the west coast, taking it within just a few days. As the main Premier army was centered around the Gary Nation border and its eastern heartland, the coalition would swiftly take Western Premy, as Premier just didn't view it as that important. Premier would make a speech promising his people that these lands would return soon, but it was all just a lie. Angolistan, Memistan, and Merivania all sent volunteers to fight in the Gary Nation campaign, which was an insane struggle. Premy was pushing far into Gary Nation, attempting to kidnap and murder the rebel president. However, he managed to quickly escape to Merivania. The Battle of Chinatown was one of the bloodiest battles of the war. It saw Garian, Memistani, Merivanian, and Angolish troops fighting the massive Premy army. Many said this battle would decide the fate of the Gary Nation itself. After multiple days of fighting, the coalition would be victorious, and the empire would be forced to retreat. Following the Battle of Chinatown, the Rusko-Japski armies saw their time to strike, and they launched the all-out invasion of Premy. It is finally happening. S-Day, it would be called, short for Short Day. Now, this was a comment about the Premier's, let's just say below average height. The landing was painful, tens of thousands of casualties in just the first week of the invasion. However, it was a success. The Patka bombers of the Japski army, as well as the well-trained Ruskovan soldiers, managed to push past the short Premier's defences. The march on Panovsky would begin with full force. In a shocking turn of events, the Merivanian navy would make a landing in northern Premy, and soon would meet with the Trouparian and Eriksville forces. Together they would rally the local people like the Doglandians and the Uroslavs. They would begin making their revolt, searching for independence. At this point, Premier saw the writing on the wall. He knew everything was over, and he told his men to attack with full force till the last man dies. They would defend every square inch of the empire, no matter what. And the war would drag. The war kept dragging. However, the coalition kept pushing and began attacking Panovsky city directly. The Premy soldiers couldn't take it anymore, and they surrendered en masse. Premier made his last-ditch escape attempt, he would be seen boarding a ship out to sea, never to be seen again, and presumably dying from a storm due to the map's rough waters, and he would never be heard from since. Penofsky City would be taken over, with each nation's flag being raised over the capital. A new era of Pagan Map would begin. But where would it begin? Well, of course, at the